There is an essential teaching in Taoism that a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people read modern texts and interpretations of Taoism without the actual foundation of Taoism within those texts, and a lot of people then misinterpret the teachings. Now, we need to understand that Taoism at its core obviously is a text that is about being in harmony with the Tao and living Wu Wei. But in the Dao de Jing, this is informed through a critique of Confucian morality. So this is something that people don't understand. Taoism essentially is a critique of Confucian morality, or Confucianism. And people misinterpret that about the text because we see it from a modern perspective. And then we think it's just about being in harmony with the Tao and living Wu Wei, which is actually the core of the Dao de Jing. But that is not what is informing it. We need to remember that when Lao Tzu or whoever wrote the Dao de Jing, this was back in the Warring States period of China, when Confucianism was rife, when it had just begun, the teachings of Confucius. And Taoism runs counter to Confucianism. And I read a lot of comments on some of my Taoist videos, and a lot of people say, but Confucianism is just another path to the Tao or something like this. And this is a complete misinterpretation and a misunderstanding actually of what Confucianism is and why Taoism came about in the first place, which is a critique of Confucian morality and an understanding of how the Tao is not induced in the world, but rather we have to return to nature, our nature, to be in harmony with the Tao. And so there's a lot to unpack about that, and why Taoism is a critique of Confucianism, and essentially what is Confucian morality. So we don't want to get into that trap of saying all paths lead to the Tao or lead to Brahman or God. We don't want to get into that trap because there are philosophical differences between a lot of traditions. And a lot of spiritual paths are not equally efficacious. That's what we need to understand. And when we're talking about Confucianism, a lot of people don't really understand what Confucianism is. But to get a grasp of what Confucianism is, you need to understand the psychology of Far Eastern Asia, specifically places like China, Korea, and Japan. And you see this effect of Confucianism on the people in those countries. And this gives us a good understanding of why Taoism came about in the first place, to give people an understanding of how the Tao actually is in the world, rather than trying to induce it into the world as Confucius thinks we need to do. And so, as I said, there's a lot to unpack here about the Confucian morality that Taoism critiques. Taoism is essentially against the regime of sincerity promoted by Confucian morality. Now, this idea of the regime of sincerity was coined by one of the great scholars of Taoism in the modern world, Hans Georg Moeller. And I highly recommend that you read one of his books called Genuine Pretending, which we will unpack a little bit about what genuine pretending is a little bit further in this episode and why it is important. First of all, we need to understand that Confucian morality came about because of the idea that before there was Confucianism, we were primitive and uncultured and essentially beast-like. According to Confucianism, its morality is supposedly what makes us human and is natural, which it sounds quite odd that some sort of external form of governance imposed on people is some sort of form of nature. But this is the idea in Confucianism, this idea of this system, this Confucian morality that we cultivate is what makes us human and is natural, according to Confucius and the whole system in general. So Confucianism is a socially imposed system that people are supposed to treat as if it is natural. But what does this whole process actually do to the people, and what really is Confucianism? Confucianism is essentially an education and domestic program designed to train people to be sincere. But Taoism exposes the falsity and hypocrisy within Confucian morality. Taoism explains that Confucian morality can actually lead to all sorts of pathologies. And the reason why is the regime of sincerity leads to an over-identification with one's role. And these roles that we're supposed to play within the Confucian design actually runs counter to morality itself, because they're often hierarchical. So we have this imbalance between gender, and yes, Confucius didn't have a high opinion of women. So there is an imbalance between gender, obviously between young and old. You also have filial piety within the family, so there's this whole hierarchical system within the family. And there's also other things like within Confucian morality where women have to bind their feet, so they bind their feet. This is all part of the system. It gets pretty nutty, but there's a lot of things within Confucian morality that we're supposed to follow, and this is why Taoism explains that this leads to all sorts of pathologies. Taoism itself, being a natural methodology, is naturally against all sorts of social hierarchy. This morality of Confucius, as I mentioned, is his idea of how the Tao is induced in the world, of how we cultivate the Tao within oneself and within society through following all of these crazy rules and regulations, like all of these hierarchical positions within society, binding the feet and so forth and so on. But we have to realize that his understanding of Confucian morality and morality in general, of how the Tao is induced in the world, is an artificial and external system of governance that is not natural, and it can never be natural because it is artificial and external. We actually discover through all the Confucian texts this sort of Confucian morality that we're supposed to follow to become this idea of being human through cultivating this humanness by following all of this Confucian morality. One of the core texts in Confucianism is the doctrine of the mean, and this actually explains that Confucian morality is the natural order, and in order to be human, we all order to submit to it. Chapter 22 of the Doctrine of the Mean states, "Sincerity is the Tao, way of nature, heaven. Making it sincere is the Tao, way of humankind." So according to this text and Confucian morality in general, his idea is that when we look at the stars and the moon, they follow a certain course of nature and they never deviate from that course. And so just like that, we should never deviate from the Confucian morality imposed upon us. So we need to fully commit to it with our bound feet and all. And if we don't commit to it fully, then we are not human. Now, this is obviously a backflip towards Taoism, because if you said that from a Taoist perspective, to be like the moon, be like the stars, and just follow the course of nature, that doesn't mean we follow a external opposed system. We just follow nature itself and our internal nature, not some imposed system. So this is quite odd, and this is what Confucianism does to people, because they actually think that if they follow this system, then they will be human, bringing the Tao into the world. So you need to be at ease in being uncomfortable with your bound feet, sleeping in certain positions, sitting upright all the time, and never speaking out of tone. So you have to be at complete ease with this. And as absurd as it sounds, this is what Confucian morality demands of you. Obviously, when we look at this and we unpack it, there are a lot of problems that can occur by following a certain system, a very strict system like this. And Taoism does point this out. And as I said, the Tao Te Ching and other texts like the Zhuangzi are a critique on Confucianism. So they are explaining the natural way as opposed to Confucius's idea of what the natural way is, through all of this self-cultivation according to his own rules and regulations. Three main problems occur by following this regime of sincerity demanded upon us by Confucian morality. The first is a no-brainer, and we actually still see this friction within Far East Asia because Confucianism is still the fundamental psychology of most people. And this first problem, by following the regime of sincerity, is stress. Now, obviously, there is a lot of stress in people who follow this regime of sincerity because you are always checking your appearance and your status. You're always mindful about how you look and your status in society. These are so important to people who follow Confucianism. And you see this a lot in Far East Asia. My wife is Korean, and so I've spent a lot of time in Korea, and Koreans have to always look a certain way, and they're always so self-conscious of their status. It's so important to have a high status within society. And you also see this obviously in China, Japan. But you'll always see people super well dressed, always mindful about how they look, hardly ever speaking their mind naturally, always following the socially accepted norms. It's a very, very conventional life. And as we know, Taoism is completely opposite. It's totally unconventional. And stress is also accumulated by following the regime of sincerity, because there are way too many details to follow if you are going to follow Confucian morality to its nth degree. Now, what I mean by that is not only your bound feet, but you also have to follow all sorts of rules. Like this, there are particular ways to sit, there are particular ways to talk, there are particular ways to behave when you are around certain age groups, and also there is a certain way to sleep. So according to your position within society, there are certain positions of how you should sleep to be human, to be a cultured human, according to Confucius. Yes, I mean that Confucianism actually wants you to sleep in a certain position, because the belief is this is what will make you a human. So what position you sleep corresponds to your role. All of this is actually in the Analects. It's in the Confucius's main text. You'll find a lot of the Confucian morality in the Analects. This is the stress that occurs by over-identifying with your role within society, which is what Confucianism actually wants you to do. They want you to over-identify with the role to the point that you actually believe you are the role. So the second problem by following this regime of sincerity is worthlessness. And this one's not actually hard to figure out, because when we look at roles themselves, roles are typically hierarchical. And we see that still in today's world. Roles are typically hierarchical, where we have, even within the family, we have in the social setting, we have in our jobs, we have in our friendships. There's sometimes even within friendships, there's subtle forms of hierarchy that's going on. And so what can happen is this can produce worthlessness, and often does produce worthlessness, especially within Confucian morality, because the hierarchical structures are so set in stone. So most people have an experience of being in a lower position within this hierarchical structure, even in today's world. And so when we have this feeling of that we are beneath other people within this hierarchical structure, this is where the worthlessness begins to grow within us. And this is where that sort of pathology begins to grow. And this happens because you are identifying with that role, completely identifying with that role. And if you are in a lower position, or even worst case scenario, you are in one of the very lowest positions, then this is going to breed all sorts of psychopathy. Essentially built into this system of hierarchy is an institutionalized and internalized inferiority complex. So this inferiority complex is part and parcel of Confucian morality and the regime of sincerity. It's just part of it. And that's something we need to realize. And that's still actually with us today on a very subtle level. The third problem from following Confucian morality and the regime of sincerity is vanity. So just as when we identify with the lower position, we have feelings of worthlessness, when people begin to identify with a higher position, say if they're a king or some sort of manager at a job, or they're a professor or the philosopher or someone in a high position of prestige, then this is a breeding ground for conceit. Actually, in this hierarchical structure, conceit is an institutionalized part of this whole system. We all know too well that there are many people, even in the modern world, and that have existed all throughout time, who have had this level of conceit and this idea that other people in lower positions are beneath them. So this is another big problem from following Confucian morality and the regime of sincerity. So no matter how you look at this, Confucian morality is a problem, not a solution. Confucian morality naturally produces falsity, hypocrisy, and selfishness. So the whole irony with all of this Confucian morality and the regime of sincerity is Confucianism is actually part of the problem that it claims to resolve. This is where Taoism comes in and critiques Confucianism, because all of these underlying problems that cause conflict within the individual and within the society. Taoism points out that all of this craziness and suffering that we experience results from this regime of sincerity imposed upon society. People naturally develop psychopathies that affect the world. Psychopathic and sociopathic norms lead to a psychopathic and sociopathic world. So the heart of this psychopathy that I'm talking about is that Confucianism is fundamentally paradoxical, because you try and naturalize what is not natural. That's where all the craziness begins. You are trying to naturalize which is not natural. The Confucian structure is not natural. Any external structure is not natural if it's a man-made structure. Chapter 18 of the Tao Te Ching actually explains this best, because it states that all of these human virtues, according to Confucius, are actually an expression of the decay of psychopathy. Chapter 18 states, "When the great Tao is dispensed with, there is humanity and righteousness. When knowledge and smartness come out, then there is great falsity. When the 6 family relations are not harmonious, then there is filial piety and compassion. When state and families are in confusion, then there are upright ministers." Try not to misinterpret this chapter from a modern perspective. Now, when it mentions knowledge and smartness, it is talking about what is right according to Confucian morality. A lot of people read less accurate versions of the Tao Te Ching where they see it say knowledge and wisdom and this and that. So people think that, oh, we shouldn't read books and this and that. This is a problem. This is what people misinterpret about Taoism and the Tao Te Ching. So this is why it's important about what I'm talking about today, because Taoism itself is a critique of Confucianism, and you find that in this chapter. So don't think that when you read this in English that knowledge and smartness means, oh, I better not be smart or I better not seek knowledge. That's not what it means. What it means is that following what is right according to Confucian morality leads to hypocrisy. So please, before you judge a text on its English translation, it's always best to know actually what it is referring to, even though it may relate to you from a modern perspective. And yes, the Tao Te Ching is always relevant, even though it is a critique on Confucianism. It is relevant to any society that have ever existed. It's one of those sort of eternal texts that can always critique, all of this socialization we have and all of this so-called morality that's imposed upon us, and it can show us the way to be in harmony with the Tao and also how to live wu-wei naturally. So yes, we could say, yeah, okay, knowledge and smartness, from a modernist perspective, these sentiments are true, but you don't want to misinterpret the text and start to make up your own interpretation of what Lao Tzu is saying. Do not be one of those people. Just absorb the teachings as they are and learn from them, and be humble and grow and learn more about them. So what chapter 18 and the Tao Te Ching are talking about is that life was better before all of this Confucian cultivation and socialization. Now, that's one of the main tenets of the Tao Te Ching, is that all of this socialization and cultivation is what actually warps our nature, and that's what we still experience today. Zhuangzi actually speaks about this at length in the Zhuangzi text, which is one of my all-time favorite texts. In chapter 9, you have a robber, his name's Robber Zhe, and like with anything in the Zhuangzi, Zhuangzi commends the hunchback, the robber, the drunk, all of these. There's a lot of humor in the Zhuangzi. But in chapter 9, we see a dialogue between Robber Zhe and Confucius. And Robber Zhe explains to Confucius that life was better before all of this Confucian morality, all of this cultivation. Chapter 9 is essentially about the hypocrisy of the claim that Confucianism is rooted in any kind of state of nature. This is obvious to us now when we study Confucianism and Taoism, but it wasn't so obvious to the people back in the Warring States period of China, and still it's not obvious to the people in Far East Asia now. And I will say that it's probably not obvious to most people in the world, because most people in the world do follow some sort of external form of governance or way of thinking, that most of us acquiesce to some sort of external form of philosophy or governance. And this, according to Taoism, is what essentially warps our nature, and this is what Robert Drew would be against in the Zhuangzi. Chapter 29 actually points out that all of this regime of sincerity, by following this strict Confucian morality, actually brings about violence. So all of this idea that we're going to be human by following this morality and we were beasts before is actually an illusion, because all of this stress that we accumulate by following this morality brings about violence, which causes a lot of conflict in the world. Again, this all comes down to the over-identification with our role within society and the family and so forth and so on. We have fully identified with whatever role we have been given by the society, and this is where all the trouble begins, because we believe we're this role and we don't understand that we're something else. So we have this conflict with our natural essence as opposed to this role and this idea of who we should be that we're supposed to live up to. This expectation that other people have of us and how we are supposed to appear to other people. There is this friction within inside of us. But the Taoist solution to this over-identification with roles and the regime of sincerity is quite unique. Taoism itself is not saying that roles don't exist, but the way they go about it is very intelligent and skillful. Taoism actually acknowledges that playing roles are an existential condition of social life. The important word here is playing, which I will explain in a minute. This existential condition is actually realized by an individual we often find within the great Taoist texts, and usually translated as a genuine person, a true man of Tao, an authentic person, or a perfected person, etc. Like, it depends on how you translate it. Genuine is actually the ideal word we should use here, because using other words like authentic may be problematic. But genuine is the ideal word and probably more closer to the translation. And according to Hans-Georg Maueller, this type of person can actually be called a genuine pretender. The origins of a genuine person are first found in the Dao de Jing through the word Zhen. Zhen, which appears in the Dao de Jing, actually means having variation and being genuine. It doesn't technically mean genuine person, but when we look in the Zhuangzi, this is when we first find Zhen Ren. In the Zhuangzi, Zhen Ren means a genuine person or genuine individual, however you want to say it. And this Zhen Ren is very important within Taoist philosophy, because this gives us a better understanding of what it means to be genuine, what it means to be the authentic article of being human. And a Zhen Ren, a genuine person, is highly skillful and has a deeper understanding of life and is in harmony with the Tao and lives Wu Wei. So this is what a Zhen Ren is. And this is very important when we talk about roles and this regime of sincerity. A genuine person is capable of not internalizing any roles, which actually runs counter to Confucianism. So you've got to remember that a genuine person is capable of not internalizing any role. So not making it and not confusing it as part of their actual natural self. So a genuine person enacts roles playfully and skillfully. The big difference and why variation is important in the translation is that they don't identify with any role. They have an ability just to move between roles, and there's this effortlessness about them where they are not confusing externally opposed roles and beliefs upon our natural essence, our nature, what is connected to the Tao. They're not confusing that and commingling that and mixing that where to the point where we over-identify with our role, which actually leads to all sorts of psychopathies. But also you need to remember, a genuine person is not trying to also be authentic. They're not trying either way. They're not trying to be the role, and they're not trying to be authentic. There's not this trying quality about them. They're not trying to do anything other than just be in harmony with the Tao, just living. And even that, there's not even an idea that they need to be in harmony with the Tao, because they're already in harmony with the Tao. And the reason a genuine person doesn't offer any alternative, that you should do this to be authentic, or you should do this to play your role well, is because the world is full of opinions. And from a Taoist perspective, there are way too many opinions in the world, and this actually runs counter to nature. And because there are so many opinions of how life should be and what we should believe, then this is what actually causes all the conflict and violence in the world. And this is one of the main tenets within Taoism, is this path of non-interference, of allowing life to actually just happen as it will. And you just follow the way, you follow the Tao, and wherever it takes you, it takes you. This is very similar to the path of Shiva. So Shiva followers believe that, Shiva is just guiding their life to wherever they need to be and to experience whatever they need to experience. And so in the same way, a genuine person within Taoism is not imposing any sort of belief structure or way of doing things for other people, because that would be interfering with someone else's nature. This brings me back to the title that Hans Georg Mauweller coined, which is genuine pretender and genuine pretending. So genuine pretending essentially is that you understand that any role you have is played. It's not who you are, it's played. This is the important difference. We cannot but play roles in a social setting. And even in those simple societies that existed before Confucianism, there were roles, but that still was understood that roles themselves are essentially played. So within those sorts of more natural societies, those more Taoist societies pre-Confucianism, there was an understanding that the roles themselves are being played. So it wasn't that roles didn't exist. This is what I'm trying to say, because that would imply some sort of primitivist culture. But Taoism is not linked to a primitivist culture, which a lot of people don't understand. It's more linked to a simple way of life that is psychologically and physically healthy, which connects you to that greater source that we call the Tao, or call it Brahman, or what you will. So a genuine person understands that there is no correspondence between the roles we play and our natural essence. And there is no falseness or hypocrisy involved here, because there is no contradiction between an authentic self and an inauthentic role player. A Taoist enacts roles knowing that the role itself is temporary and is somewhat coincidental. So this gives the Taoist a great ability to change roles without taking them too seriously. So that's where the variation comes in of the Gen Ren, is that they can move effortlessly through life and not attach to any certain role that they've been given, even if they were the king, even if they were the queen. It doesn't matter, they can move effortlessly between roles and not overly identify with them. So in conclusion, as I said, the Taoist critique on Confucianism actually still relates to our modern world and all of this socialization and morality that's imposed upon us. So this is why it's important to understand what is being said today about the regime of sincerity and all of this morality and this over-identification with roles. So we need to understand that the condition of being human is that we play roles, but we need to sincerely understand that all roles are being played. This is what has to be understood. So the difference between someone who identifies with their role and a Gen Ren is that a Gen Ren can assume any appearance without suffering, because they reside in the still point of the Tao, that zero perspective that is our natural essence. Shanti, shanti, shanti.